Well, headlines have been buzzing about the IRS's latest court filing surrounding the Johnson Amendment, and we'll get into some of that. But for those who don't know, what is the Johnson Amendment?
So the Johnson Amendment was an amendment to one of the statutes implementing the whole tax code. It was introduced by then Senator Johnson, I believe, in the mid 1950s. And what it did is it forbids 501c3 organizations, which obviously would include religious organizations, from, I believe the statutory language is participating in political activities, essentially. And so it's a law that has been on the books for about 70 years now, but it's blatantly unconstitutional and has been from the day that it was first passed into law, even back then. In many ways, it's a relic of a bygone era. If you recall, back then, there was an effort just across the board to stamp religion out of the public squares. You see that with the Supreme Court rulings that came down during that time, just forbidding any sort of government acknowledgments of religion or otherwise religious activity in the public square. And this is another example of that, where it was used to stifle the speech of churches around this country.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because some of the history around why Johnson wanted this also purportedly surrounded two organizations that happened to be secular that railed against his Senate run. And it was almost, part of him sort of going back against those organizations, right? Which, if that's true, that's interesting, because that doesn't seem like a very good impetus to create an entire structure around why no nonprofit should have any right to have a political opinion. One thing that is also interesting, when this was revisited in 1987, the IRS strengthened this, and it was not just you can't endorse a candidate, you also couldn't oppose a candidate, which is interesting. So we now have this switch. And I want to dig into the unconstitutional part of this, because right now what's going on is there is a lawsuit, the National Religious Broadcasters, and I believe two churches suing over this issue, suing the IRS, and the IRS coming to a proposed settlement where they will relieve churches of the restrictions around the Johnson Amendment. Can you take us through, because there's some confusion, I think, where this language was from the IRS and what you interpret it to actually mean now?
So the language, as I said before, and as we've discussed a bit here, is about endorsing or opposing political candidates and otherwise engaging in political activity. That's what the statute says, and the IRS has been implementing that over the years. Now, interestingly enough, even though this law has been on the books for a long time, it really hasn't been brought against churches. It's very rare for a church to have actually lost its tax-exempt status. If you go back and look over the years, there's maybe a handful of times where that has ever happened. And I believe the instance where it did involved a church actually taking out, I believe, a actual ad in a newspaper or other publication explicitly opposing a political candidate. So it's something that's been on the books for a long time, but really hasn't been enforced against churches. But the practical reality is just the existence of that law on the books has chilled the speech of pastors for many, many years. I recall just in this last election cycle, I saw clips of sermons circulating, and there was a pastor at an African-American church who basically said that he consulted with lawyers before talking about something political in the church. And that just seemed ludicrous to me. The thought that a pastor would have to go to lawyers and otherwise contact politicians to talk about, well, what can I say from the pulpit, was ludicrous. And in that instance, funny enough, it was a pastor who then went on to give a quasi-endorsement to Joe Biden back when he was running for re-election. And so that's something else to bear out of this, is that this change that has now happened is a sea change, and it enables freedom for people of all political persuasions. They shouldn't have to go to lawyers if their faith calls them to endorse one candidate or another, or they feel like one candidate's positions on the issues aligns better with their religious beliefs. People across this country have values, and they're going to vote according to those values, and that includes people of faith. And so we should no longer operate under this delusion that people of faith should not be guided by their religious principles in making voting decisions in the same way among churches.
Well, and so let's talk about the language and the change, right? Because the IRS for 70 years, this has been upheld and strengthened, this Johnson Amendment. Now we have the IRS in this court filing basically saying if a church is communicating, I want you to correct any of this, or, this is my understanding of this. If a church is communicating, or a pastor from the pulpit or through any other church communication to the audience, it's similar to a family conversation. It's something that should be permissible about a candidate, for or against a candidate, and that churches are not at risk of losing their 501c3 status if they engage in this. Would that be sort of the correct understanding of what the IRS is now stating? Now, this isn't finalized yet, but that is what they are saying in this document, correct?
That is what the IRS is saying in this court filing. What they're saying is that if you are a religious organization, if you're a church, and you communicate through normal means to your members, be it through the pulpit or through newsletters that you send out, email. Obviously, in today's world, there are many more means of technology of communicating than there were when this law was first implemented in the 1950s. But if you are using your usual means of communicating with your members, you are allowed to endorse political candidates. You are allowed to sort of have that family conversation. And I think that that's a great way of thinking about this. I mean, churches in general use they refer to each other as brother and sister, father. So churches think of themselves already as a big family in a lot of ways. And so this new filing in the court implements this widespread understanding by churches that when we're talking about these issues as a family, it's basically the same thing as gathering around the kitchen table with your family and having these sorts of sane conversations.
Yeah. And, okay, so when we look at this, I've seen some different interpretations in media. Some say that this opens the door for communication. It doesn't necessarily open the door for churches to go out and purchase advertising or engage in politics at a deeper level. What is your take on that based on what you've seen so far?
Based upon the language in the filing, I think that, it is really about those internal sorts of communications, and it can reach a wide variety of issues on what you can communicate internally and what you can send out internally. I think that the key is it's internally facing. Now, it may be accessible to the general public, but you would have to go to the church's website. You would have to go to the church and actually be there for a sermon delivery, or otherwise be on an email listserv, something like that, in order
or YouTube
for what the IRS has said now. Exactly. YouTube. I mean, as in the post-COVID world, I think a lot of churches broadcast where it's accessible by the public, but it is still really designed at the end of the day. It's about an internal communication happening amongst the church.
Well, I want to go back to something you said at the start of this, that the Johnson Amendment, in your view, is unconstitutional. So let's pull back even more. We're talking about just churches here because that's what the lawsuit was dealing with national religious broadcasters. But and their claim was that it was a restriction of their First Amendment rights, the Johnson Amendment. Would you, from your legal perspective, like to see the entire Johnson Amendment thrown out, regardless of, for every nonprofit, not just churches?
I think the Johnson Amendment is highly problematic from a constitutional standpoint because it goes to restricting the content of speech. And if you think about any other context in this country, if the government is telling you what you can or can't say, our gut reaction is that is unconstitutional. That is not the way our society should work. The government should not be able to restrict the content of your speech. So yes, across the board, the Johnson Amendment should not exist because of the problems that it imposes on any kind of speech, but it's doubly protected when we're talking about religious speech. And so that's problematic under the free speech doctrine and under the free exercise doctrine. It invades church autonomy. There are many, many problems with this law just across the board. And something interesting to note just about the Johnson Amendment in general, it's also an exercise in futility in many ways, because if you go into the IRS code and you look at it, churches are automatically tax exempt, even setting aside the 501c3 filings and the 501c3 status that many churches across this country have. You don't actually have to have that as a church to be tax exempt. You just are tax exempt by virtue of being a church.
So, one of the things that I'm seeing from a lot of people, and there was a letter back in 2017 that about 99 religious groups had sent to the IRS trying to encourage the IRS at the time to push back on Trump's efforts then to curtail the Johnson Amendment. I notice a lot of times it happens to be more liberal or progressive religious groups and institutions that are upset about the Johnson Amendment potentially going away. Why do you think that is? Why does it seem to be one side? Again, even in the faith realm of the progressive side, they seem more perturbed by this and they want to hold it in place. Do you have any theories on why that may be?
I do. I think that this has been used by a weapon. Ironically enough, it's been used less as a weapon by the actual government and the IRS and more as a weapon by really hostile progressive groups, specifically the sort of groups that would bring lawsuits challenging other displays of faith. So you're talking about the Americans United for Church and State, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and those types of groups. And what they would do is if they ever saw particularly a pastor endorsing or otherwise saying something positive about a conservative political candidate, they would immediately issue a press release. They would immediately file a letter with the IRS saying, you need to investigate that church. You need to take away their tax exempt status. And so it's part of this larger movement from certain progressive groups that they don't think churches should be tax exempt at all. And so while here they are now complaining because they've lost a weapon that they've used to silence pastors for a long time, it fits into a broader worldview that is hostile to religion in general. So those who are complaining about this, their problem is less about what's happening here and more broadly with the existence of churches and their role in our society.
Yeah, it's very interesting to watch. And one last question. There's also panic about campaign finance. I keep seeing that come up here. How does this affect campaign finance laws? Does this create a crisis where now, before you answer, it is interesting because if you're saying that any church, and if we were to extend that to any nonprofit, if we were going to get rid of the Johnson Amendment entirely, can hold these views or go for or against a candidate, it seems like equal opportunity, right? Everybody can do it. They're permitted to do it. So what do you make of that argument that this is a campaign finance issue to get rid of the Johnson Amendment?
Well, I would say that it's more of a speech issue at the end of the day. This isn't really about money that we're talking about here. We're talking about pure speech, what an organization says, the issues that it takes. I mean, here at First Liberty, we have represented two churches just in the past year that were investigated by the IRS for things like inviting a local politician to come and give a testimonial and then to pray for her. That was investigated by the IRS, and they ultimately held that that did not implicate or violate the Johnson Amendment in any way, and so they were allowed, they blessed that activity. And the same thing with another church where they would simply provide educational materials about candidates and their positions to people. And again, someone complained, and that caused the IRS to open an investigation. And it again concluded that no, educating your members about the positions of political candidates, again, does not violate the Johnson Amendment. And what we see now with this consent decree is a continuation of what we had been seeing with the matters that we have been handling. And it's not a matter of campaign finance. It is a matter of speech and allowing people to live out their faith in all aspects of their life, including those that touch into the political realm.
Yeah, I mean, and just as we close out here, this language is in a proposed settlement that is not yet approved. Is it possible that this language somehow goes away or a judge doesn't approve it? I don't know the way that process works. Is it possible, we're all talking about this, that the IRS steps away from this new position somehow?
I would say that nothing is final until the judge signs it, but this is a very routine thing that happens when the government is a defendant in a lawsuit, is the parties will reach a settlement agreement and will then file an agreement with the court, and the court should sign off on it. Nothing's final until it's final, but this is a very routine thing for courts to do.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time breaking this down, and we'll have you back soon. I'm sure there'll be more news on this. It's going to be a very big deal. Appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.